in the middle of the cold metal heart of Station Delta Echo 6, where species from across the stars gathered to trade, talk, and tolerate each other under the banner of peace. There walked a human named Tom. He wore a stained blue jumpsuit with a broken zipper and carried an old toolkit with cracked edges. His boots made soft, dull sounds on the steel floor as he moved from corridor to corridor, fixing wires, rerouting cables, checking pressure valves without ever getting in anyone's way or asking for praise. The Lizardkind ran this station in both name and pride. Their tall, scaly forms moved with the kind of arrogance only years of dominance could give. They spoke in hissing tones, their tails swaying behind them as they barked orders at anyone who dared to linger too long in their presence. They believed strength was born from bloodline and history, not quiet effort or technical skill. To them, humans were soft, fragile, inefficient creatures who spoke too kindly and bent too easily. Tom did not argue with this image. He fixed what was broken and left what worked alone. He nodded when spoken to and spoke only when needed. He was not a soldier, not a scientist, not a diplomat, just a maintenance worker with a knack for making things run a little better than before. That was all he needed to be on a regular day in the reactor wing. The lights began to flicker. A red warning shimmered on a nearby screen. Low radiation leak within secondary flow control chamber. Unstable pressure detected. Above it stood a Lizardkind technician named Raoul, young, ambitious, eager to impress his superiors. He snarled at the alert, tapping at the console with clawed fingers, but the problem only grew worse. A pulsing hum filled the hallway, a sign the heat buildup inside the core was approaching dangerous levels. Raoul growled and hissed orders at passing workers, most of whom fled the scene or stood frozen, unsure what to do. The system was too complex, the readouts too scrambled. One mistake, and the section could explode, sealing off half the station and exposing hundreds to deadly radiation. Tom had been in the corner inspecting a loose pipe when the warning lights began to pulse. He glanced at the panel, then at Raoul, who now shouted louder than before. Tom stepped forward slowly, quietly, and said in a calm voice, "The coolant bypass is jammed. It needs manual override from below, not here." Raoul turned with a glare, eyes narrowed, lips pulled back in a sneer. "And you think you know this better than me?" Human Tom nodded slightly, not to argue, but to confirm what he knew. The pressure alarm screamed louder, and a sharp crack echoed through the wall. A pipe had snapped inside the core room. If they waited even another minute, the chamber would rupture. Without another word, Tom dropped his toolkit, opened the access hatch beneath the floor, and slipped into the crawl space. Rails sputtered in protest but didn't follow. The air below was hot and buzzing with energy. Cables glowed, and coolant hissed through tight passageways. Tom moved fast. He bypassed the jammed node, readed the flow using spare tubing, then kicked the stuck valve into place. The system groaned once, then stilled. The lights stopped flashing. The red alert faded above him. Silence fell like a heavy blanket. Tom climbed out, wiping sweat from his forehead, and collected his tools. The gathered crowd of workers, aliens, and even two station guards stared at him with wide eyes. Raoul's face twisted with a mix of confusion and rage. He barked laughter, pretending the whole thing had never been serious. He clapped Tom on the back with too much force and hissed loudly, "Well, I suppose that was a small favor from our human guest. Thank you for your help." Worker Tom only gave a tired nod and walked away, unaware that his act would soon echo far beyond that hallway. In the break room later, a group of engineers whispered about the incident. One of them, a bird-like mechanic from the Disgrace, tilted his head and said that human fixed a meltdown with old tubing and elbow grease while that lizard just shouted commands. Someone else replied, "I saw it too." He knew exactly what to do. The Lizardkind technician almost fried us all. Word began to spread. Quietly at first, then faster through the maintenance and engineering decks. Small conversations about how reliable human workers were, how they stayed calm under pressure, how they fixed problems instead of making them worse. These talks slipped through the station's social layers, reaching even command-level officers who dismissed them as idle gossip, but some noticed. Raoul noticed too. He tried to laugh it off, tried to act as though he had guided the repair, tried to convince others it had been a team effort, yet no one truly believed him. The sensors recorded everything, and it was clear who had gone under the floor and who had panicked in front of the panel. Still, Tom said nothing of it. He had another job waiting in Sector 12. A flickering guidance array. He packed his tools again, slung his kit over one shoulder, and moved on without fanfare, unaware that his simple act had shaken the confidence of a proud species without firing a shot, without raising his voice, without needing to prove anything. A small favor, they called it, but it would become the first crack in the great wall of Lizardkind pride, and it had begun with a human crawling through the dark with a wrench in hand and no intention of being remembered. Days passed slowly on Station Delta Echo 6, with its endless corridors, its steady hum of machines, and its routine alerts that rarely meant anything serious, but deep beneath the surface, something had changed, something quiet and invisible, like a shift in gravity that no one could explain, but everyone could feel. Tom kept to his usual schedule, fixing loose vents, replacing worn-out coils, inspecting faulty circuits, and helping whoever called for help. His steps followed the same old routes, and his voice remained just as quiet as before. But now when he entered a room, conversations, slowed, eyes turned, heads tilted, not with mockery, but with quiet curiosity. Even the smallest of gestures held weight when made by someone who had once kept the station from tearing itself apart. It wasn't just humans who noticed the shift. The winged Zeke engineers began to request Tom by name. The insectoid Crix workers made room for him to pass without being told. The silent flow beast from Deck 17 paused its motion one day to nod its translucent head at him, and even the usually stubborn Rook miners began to leave handwritten notes of thanks near panels Tom had repaired. He never asked for this attention, and truthfully he didn't want it. All he had done was stop a meltdown. He had done it because someone needed to, and no one else seemed able or willing. That was all. But stories on a space station moved faster than radiation through a damaged core, and this story was now traveling across decks and species, and even command levels. The Lizardkind were not blind to the whispers. They felt them like a cold wind under a sealed door, and it made their scales itch and their tails twitch. They had ruled this station with authority and pride. They had enforced order through fear and reputation, and they had never been challenged by battle, not by vote, and certainly not by humans, who were still viewed as newcomers to the galactic stage. Rail walked the station now with tighter shoulders and a forced grin. His usual crowd of supporters followed more from habit than loyalty, and even they spoke in lower tones when he passed them. By the incident in the reactor wing had been logged officially as a minor technical fault resolved through joint effort, but no one believed the report, not even those who wrote it. Ral, as Father Commander Selvar, a senior officer among the Lizardkind, summoned his son to a private chamber and hissed through clenched teeth that weakness shown in public was not a mistake, it was betrayal. He reminded Rael that their species had earned their place through domination and brilliance, not by letting mammals fix their errors. Rael tried to defend himself, said the system had been unfamiliar. The situation rushed. The human had interfered, but his words fell flat, and the glare from his father burned deeper than radiation. Meanwhile, Tom continued his work quietly. One morning he found a handwritten note from a Crix engineer thanking him for rerouting the climate system in the lower decks. The note was neatly folded and tucked beside his toolkit, and though Tom said nothing, he placed the note gently into a side pocket of his uniform and carried on. In the mess hall, the changes became more visible. Lizardkind officers who used to occupy the central seating began to find their tables half empty. The Zeke and Crix workers now clustered around humans, asking for stories about Earth or advice on system tuning, or just sitting with them in quiet solidarity. What had once been an unspoken hierarchy was now being questioned, not through rebellion or violence, but through quiet respect for competence. Tom never claimed leadership, but he was becoming one in the eyes of many. He simply did what needed doing, and that alone began to inspire others. Humans who once kept their heads down now stood a little taller, spoke a little louder, offered suggestions during team meetings that were now actually considered. One afternoon, a minor energy surge struck a navigation module near the docking bays. Tom arrived to find two junior Lizardkind engineers already there, arguing over which command protocol to follow. They ignored a small blinking signal, which Tom recognized instantly as a proximity alarm. He moved past them, quickly opened a side panel, and pulled a failing fuse just seconds before it overloaded. The emergency lights faded, and the system returned to normal, the two Lizardkind said. Nothing. Tom gave a short nod and walked away, but behind him, a small crowd of workers had seen everything, and they began to murmur again. A Zeke whispered under its breath, "The lizards talk too much. The human just fixes what matters by now." Small groups had begun gathering during off hours, sharing their experiences, frustrations, and thoughts about the way things worked on the station. Many agreed that the system heavily favored the Lizardkind, not because they were more capable, but because they had always claimed the spotlight before anyone else could step forward. Now the illusion was beginning to break. The officers noticed these gatherings. They noticed the change in seating, the change in work logs, the sudden increase in requests for human engineers over Lizardkind teams. They sent out new memos urging all species to follow proper hierarchy and communication protocols. But the messages were ignored more than they were read. Back in his quarters, Tom sat at his small metal desk, tightening bolts on his toolkit. He had received 3 repair requests that day, all outside his assigned zones, but he hadn't turned any of them down. He preferred to stay useful, preferred the noise of engines and circuits over meetings and speeches. He had no interest in politics, but he could see the pressure building around him. People were watching him, not because he was loud or bold, but because he kept doing what worked, and in a place full of broken systems, that was all anyone really wanted. In another part of the station, Rail stood in front of a cracked monitor, staring at a looped playback of the reactor incident, watching Tom descend into the crawl space, watching the alarm lights fade, watching the quiet shift in the Baiwa room afterward. Again and again, each time he watched it, he felt something sink deeper in his gut. Not just embarrassment, but the sharp edge of fear. Small favor had not stayed small, it had become something else entirely, and the worst part was no one had tried to make it happen. It simply had. The balance aboard Station Delta Echo 6 had begun to shift like a starship caught in slow gravitational pull, subtle yet unstoppable. What once seemed fixed and unmoving now bent under quiet pressure. No alarms, no riots, no confrontations, only changes too small to notice until they added up to something no one could ignore. Lizardkind Command tried to hold on to order through routine drills and ceremonial inspections. They increased patrols in the corridors, reinforced discipline among their ranks, and reminded everyone through official broadcasts that the station remained under their protection and guidance. But these actions rang hollow to many. Now their voices still carried the same sharp edge, but the weight behind them had lessened, as though something in their image had cracked and light was beginning to shine through it. The heart of this unease walked Tom, still dressed in the same old jumpsuit, still carrying the same battered toolbox, still refusing to speak more than needed. His reputation had spread beyond the engineering decks, reaching even the upper command rings where political decisions were made. His name came up in quiet conversations, his actions discussed behind closed doors with cautious interest and concealed worry. The incident in the reactor wing had not been forgotten. Instead, it had become a turning point, whispered in every corner of the station, a moment when calm logic had triumphed over panic. When a human had saved the day, not with weapons or rank, but with skill and silence. It was the kind of story that endured because it embarrassed the wrong people and inspired the rest. Raw had tried to bury the memory. He had insisted to anyone who would listen that the problem had not been critical, that Tom had merely followed his lead, that no one would even remember it after a cycle or two. But his words did not match the eyes of those who heard them. Some were polite enough to pretend. Others simply walked away, leaving Ryle to his empty pride and growing frustration. Then came the announcement that a high-level diplomatic inspection would soon arrive on the station. Representatives from the Galactic Union would conduct a full review of station operations to assess safety efficiency and interspecies cooperation. It was a routine process on paper, but everyone knew it. Carried deeper, meaning political influence, budget allocation, possible upgrades, or even replacements depending on the outcome. The Lizardkind saw this as an opportunity to restore their image, to remind everyone who held true authority on the station, and to silence the growing doubts around them. Commander Salver summoned his officers to a private meeting, where he laid out a plan to demonstrate the superiority of their systems and their personnel. He wanted to showcase one that would leave no doubt about who deserved. Commandral volunteered before anyone else could speak. He offered to lead a live systems demonstration for the Union delegates, a simulated emergency scenario handled by Lizardkind and supported by a human technician. The plan was simple: make the Lizardkind look brilliant and make the human look average, not through cruelty, but through careful planning, staged challenges, and clever editing of truth. Tom was selected without his input, summoned to participate in what was called a technical cooperation exercise. He received the details without complaint and showed up at the designated bay with his tools ready, as always, unaware of the true intent behind the event. The demonstration chamber had been prepared with full audience seating, live monitors, a running commentary by Lizardkind officers, and subtle control over which systems would glitch and when. Raoul stood on one side wearing a crisp new uniform and a fixed smile. Tom stood on the other in his patched coveralls, scanning the unfamiliar setup with quiet focus. Test began with both participants receiving identical scrambled systems. Her task was to identify the fault, reroute power, and stabilize output within a time limit. The audience watched closely, a mix of species and officials. Some curious, some skeptical, some already bored before the first minute passed. Raoul started quickly, speaking loudly as he pressed keys and moved between panels, making sure everyone could hear his explanations. He quoted protocols, referenced technical terms, and gave orders to his assistants, even though none were needed. His hands moved fast but not precisely, and small mistakes began to pile up unnoticed by him, but visible on the display screens. Tom said nothing at all. He studied the system layout silently. His fingers moved with calm efficiency, tracing the fault line, locating the bottleneck, bypassing the confusion left by the simulation. His focus was total, his movements smooth, as if he had done this 100 times before. 5 minutes in, Tom had already restored full system stability, while Raoul was still trapped in a loop caused by his own incorrect override. The audience leaned forward. Now the monitors showed performance graphs side by side, and Tom's results lit up green across the board, while Raoul's flashed red with warnings and errors. The room began to shift and mood whispers grew louder. Faces turned toward Tom, not with surprise, but with recognition, as if what they were seeing only confirmed what they had already begun to believe. Raoul tried to save face by blaming faulty inputs, but the technicians confirmed both sides had received identical conditions. There was nothing left to hide. One of the Galactic Union delegates rose from her seat and addressed Tom directly, asking how he managed the repair so quickly. Tom replied simply, "I followed the heat trail and adjusted the loop before it could collapse. Nothing special, just experience." His words were quiet, but the silence in the room gave them power. The Lizardkind hosts attempted to shift focus back to other displays, but the moment had already passed. It was clear to everyone watching that a human had outperformed a Lizardkind specialist. Under pressure in public, without anger or pride, and without even trying to compete, Raoul stood frozen, sweat visible along his neck ridges. His tail low, his mouth unable to form the excuses he had prepared. The disgrace settled over him like a heavy fog, and for the first time in his career, he felt truly small, not because of what others thought, but because he could no longer pretend he was the best. Tom picked up his toolkit and stepped down from the platform, not waiting for applause or praise. He had other tasks to finish elsewhere, more systems to fix, more work to be done. The audience watched him go with quiet respect. The story of the test spread faster than any before it, not just among workers, but through command circles, media networks, And even off-station channels it became a symbol not just of one event, but of a larger truth that competence could not be silenced, that skill could not be buried under pride, and that perhaps it was time to rethink who deserved to lead. And in that moment, the so-called favor from a human became something far more dangerous. It became undeniable proof. The air aboard Station Delta Echo 6 had changed. It was not something measured by sensors or recorded in data logs, but it could be felt by anyone who spent enough time walking its halls. There was a new quiet in the voices of the Lizardkind, a new energy among the others, as if the gravity had shifted and everyone was learning to walk again in a place where the ground no longer tilted in the same direction. The outcome of the demonstration spread like fire through every level of the station. It reached the barracks where Junior Lizardkind whispered in shame. It reached the maintenance decks where workers from all species now paused. When Tom entered, not because of curiosity anymore, but because of deep respect, it reached the command towers where even the high-ranking officers began speaking in lower tones when discussing human involvement in technical operations, and it reached Rael, who now walked in shadows trying to avoid eye contact with those who had once cheered him on. The laughter that followed him in passing was quiet, but sharp, not cruel, but cutting. He could feel the difference every time someone stepped around him. Instead of following every time a technician from another species turned their back politely, instead of standing at attention. His disgrace had not just been personal, it had been public, and it had dragged with it the pride of a people who had ruled through image for too long. Tom remained the same. He still arrived early to his repair calls, still carried the same old toolbox, still listened more than he spoke, and worked longer hours than anyone expected of him. He never mentioned the demonstration, never commented on the stares or the nods or the new invitations from higher circles, who now sought his advice on system designs and engineering flows. He turned down most of these requests with a simple reason: I already have enough work. But the silence around him was not without consequence. The Lizardkind Council grew restless, their meetings now filled with arguments and frustration. Some blamed the demonstration for being too open, others blamed Rael directly. A few dared to suggest that perhaps humans were not as inferior as tradition claimed, but such words were met with growls and threats. Old habits did not die with one failure, and old pride did not accept change easily. Commander Salver paced his office with a tight grip on his datapad, reviewing reports that painted a troubling picture. Human technicians were now being requested over Lizardkind staff in over 40% of cases. In some sectors, that number had risen above 60. The request logs did not lie, and the worst part was that these requests were not political, they were practical. No one could deny the increased efficiency, lower error rates, and faster response times that came from assigning human teams. He summoned Rael again, his voice no longer filled with anger, but something colder: disappointment. He asked what Rael planned to do to restore their name, their position, their honor. Rael stood silent for a long moment, then spoke with a sharp edge. He would expose the human for what he truly was: a low worker who got lucky, a quiet schemer who had used a single moment to rise where he did not belong. Rael's plan was desperate, but in his mind necessary. He would frame Tom for a system breach, one serious enough to cast doubt on his integrity and competence. He began by studying the maintenance schedules, waiting for Tom to be assigned to the power control substation, an area filled with delicate energy relays and override systems. One wrong move could cause cascading failures through half the station. He entered the substation the night before the assignment, carrying an override tool stolen from a restricted storage chamber. He opened the floor panel, loosened a power coupler, adjusted 2 pressure nodes just enough to trigger a fault after a delay, then resealed the panel and erased the access log. When Tom would arrive the next day and perform his check, the failure would happen under his hands and the blame would follow. But what Rael did not expect was the new cross-check protocol that had been quietly added to engineering procedures after the demonstration. All maintenance actions were now reviewed in pairs, not for punishment, but for transparency. Tom arrived at the substation the next morning, accompanied by a Zeke assistant named Lynn, who had requested to shadow him for training. Tom opened the panel, inspected the area, then paused. His eyes scanned the connectors and wiring. He tilted his head slightly, then ran a secondary scan. He noticed the slight pressure imbalance and the magnetic distortion signature left by the override tool. He turned to Lynn and said this was tampered with. Deliberately, they reported it immediately. Security teams arrived within minutes, scanning the logs and identifying the missing tool used in the sabotage. Rail's ID was tagged to the unauthorized access, his biometric trace found on the handle. The evidence was impossible to deny. The council held a formal hearing. Raul was stripped of rank, barred from engineering work, and reassigned to an outer mining post far from the core systems. His disgrace complete, his fall undeniable. The hearing was broadcast in private to certain command sectors, but word still leaked, as it always did, and the final crack in the wall of Lizardkind pride had been struck. Tom received no medal, no speech, no formal recognition. He did not attend the hearing and did not mention it afterward. Instead, he went back to the water purification lines where a pressure leak needed sealing, then to the communication towers where a relay had shorted out, then to the ventilation system on Deck 9, where a Crix child had dropped a toy into the duct. He worked quietly, spoke politely, and when asked about Ryle, he only said he hopes he finds peace where he is now and returned to his task without anger or triumph. The station had changed for good. Now humans were no longer second class. Now competence had spoken louder than lineage. Now pride had been replaced by humility. Not for all, not everywhere, but in enough corners that the shift could not be reversed. And all of it had started with one small favor. Months passed quietly on Station Delta Echo 6, but the echoes of that one moment never stopped traveling. They moved like invisible currents through metal walls and glowing wires. They filled the spaces between words in meeting rooms and shaped how workers looked at one another during morning shifts. Something had broken and something new had begun. Growing slowly, patiently, without anyone needing to force it, the Lizardkind command still held their positions. Officially, they still signed off on the reports, still gave instructions from the upper decks, still held authority over station policies. But the weight of their voices had changed. Once they spoke, and others listened without pause. Now they spoke, and others considered, weighed, decided whether to accept or to question. And in that space of thought, real change had taken root. Humans were now fully integrated across all technical departments, not as tokens or assistants, but as lead engineers, system coordinators, and diagnostic specialists. In some wings of the station, humans made up more than half the repair crews, and yet Tom still chose to remain in the same role. He had always held the same uniform, the same tools, the same path from corridor to corridor, fixing what others left behind. He had been offered promotions more than once, generous positions with higher rank and larger quarters, but he turned them down each time, politely saying he preferred to stay where he was useful and where the work was real, not filtered through reports or desk assignments. Those who knew him understood that this was not pride or stubbornness. It was his way of staying grounded in a world that had begun to shift faster than anyone expected. Species watched and learned. The Zeke formed their own joint training program with human mentors. The Crix began integrating human safety protocols into their mining designs. Even the quiet water dwellers from the dark moons sent observers to study how humans maintained such consistent performance with such simple tools and straightforward thinking. It was not about technology or raw intelligence. It was about approach and attitude, about solving problems without noise, about humility in success and focus in failure. A new hall was established near the central wing of the station, a neutral space open to all species, where technicians and engineers could meet, share ideas, test models, and learn from each other. On the far wall of that hall, a small display was installed, not large, not grand. It held no golden plaque or statue, just a simple sealed toolbox encased in clear material. A small line etched below it read in 3 languages, "Competence needs no throne." The toolbox had belonged to Tom, but he never asked for it to be displayed. The station workers collected it themselves after gifting him a new set that he at first refused until they insisted with smiles and quiet respect. He finally accepted with a nod and said thank you, then returned to sealing a cracked, coolant line in the cargo bay. The fall of Rahl had not brought joy to anyone, not even Tom. There had been no cheering, no celebration, only silence and reflection. His transfer to the distant mining post had marked the end of something, not just for him, but for the idea that authority could go unchallenged forever without earning it. Each day through action, Commander Selvar remained in his post, but his speeches grew shorter, his tone more cautious. The younger Lizardkind officers now trained alongside humans as equals, no longer separated by lineage or old traditions. The council meetings slowly began, including representatives from other species, and while change came slowly, it came with weight and meaning. One day during a quiet evening cycle, Tom received a message from a young Lizardkind cadet. The message was simple. It said, "I saw what you did, and I want to learn, not because you won, but because you didn't need to win to prove anything." Tom smiled at the message, placed it in a folder, and went back to reviewing the ventilation schedules for the lower levels. He did not reply, not because he ignored it, but because he believed some things were better understood in action than in words. Across the station, others began sharing similar messages, messages of gratitude, of curiosity, of intent to do better, to learn from others, not out of obligation, but because they saw it working, because they saw the systems running smoother. The days passing with fewer alarms and fewer errors and fewer fears. The story of the human who fixed the reactor before it melted, who solved a public challenge with calm hands, who avoided politics and chose patience, instead, had spread far beyond the station. It reached nearby colonies, trade hubs, even the core fleets. Some dismissed it as a minor tale, some called it exaggerated. But those who worked on Station Delta Echo 6 knew it was real, because they had lived through the change and seen its quiet impact unfold without force, without speeches, without battles. In the end, it was not the size of the act that mattered. It was the timing, the meaning, the refusal to let pride speak louder than reason, and the steady truth that doing the job well could shake even the strongest. Illusions Town kept walking the same halls, fixing the same panels, nodding to those who passed him by, and quietly teaching anyone who asked without asking anything in return. His story was no longer just his, it belonged to the station, to those who had watched and changed and grown from it. So what began as a small favor offered without expectation had become a lesson carved into the heart of 1,000 wires, and remembered in the silence between words. Where true respect often begins, a favor they had once mocked now stood as a legacy. A disgrace they had once denied now stood as a mirror, and in that mirror, the station saw something better than pride. It saw balance, it saw understanding, it saw hope. The end.